Everything you think you know about knights and fair maidens is a lie. Medieval romance was built on one shocking rule: the love must never be consummated. Knights devoted themselves to married noblewomen they could never possess, writing poems about women they'd never touch, suffering over relationships designed to remain forever unfulfilled. This wasn't tragic, it was deliberate. Welcome to the strangest romantic system ever invented, and the twisted logic that made it work. Welcome back to another journey into history's hidden truths. Find a comfortable position, maybe dim the lights, and let's explore something that will change how you see medieval romance forever. Before we begin, hit subscribe if you enjoy these nighttime stories, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love hearing from you. Tonight we're traveling to medieval Europe, where love was a game with very specific rules. Chapter 1. The Paradox of Courtly Love. Picture southern France, around 1150. The courts are rough places where knights settle disputes with swords, and women are valued for bloodlines and fertility. Into this brutal world comes something revolutionary: fine amour, or refined love. Poet-musicians called troubadours invent a radical concept. A knight can elevate his character through devoted service to an idealized lady. But here's the catch: she must be someone else's wife, and the love must remain unconsummated forever. The rules were codified around 1185 in a manual called The Art of Courtly Love. 31 specific instructions, like a guidebook for emotional torment. Rule 12. Marriage is no excuse for not loving someone else. Rule 14. Easy attainment makes love worthless. Difficult attainment makes it valuable. The entire system was built on obstacles, longing, and permanent unfulfillment. Desire was the fuel, but satisfaction would destroy the whole purpose. The suffering that was the achievement. How did this work in practice? A knight would select a lady, typically higher in rank, almost always married, and declare himself her devoted servant. He'd wear her colours in tournaments, compose poetry praising her beauty, perform brave deeds in her name. He'd suffer publicly over his hopeless passion. The lady would receive his devotion graciously but distantly, occasionally granting small favours, a ribbon, a kind word, permission to kiss her hand, but never offering herself physically. These relationships played out in public spaces, great halls, gardens, tournament grounds, with audiences watching and judging whether both parties performed their roles correctly. It was theatre as much as romance. The troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn wrote around 1150, "I am like Narcissus, who gazed at himself in the mirror of the well. I am so lost in thought I dare not speak." He's comparing unrequited love to Narcissus's self-destructive obsession and calling it wisdom. Another troubadour, Geoffrey Ruels, claimed to love a woman he'd never even met, the Countess of Tripoli. He wrote elaborate poems about his amour de l'encon, distant love. Whether she existed or was pure fantasy almost didn't matter. The longing itself was the achievement. He was in love with the idea of being in love with someone impossible to reach. The distance wasn't a problem to overcome. It was the entire point of the exercise. Women's perspectives are harder to find since few female voices were recorded, but the Countess of Dyer reveals a more skeptical view. Around 1175 she wrote, "I've been in great anguish over a knight I once loved. Now I see I'm betrayed because I didn't give him my love. I've suffered much grief over it in bed and dressed." She's pointing out the absurdity. Withholding physical love to maintain the game brought genuine suffering without the promised spiritual refinement. What about the husbands? Surprisingly, many tolerated or even encouraged their wives' courtly love relationships because these were understood to be performative, not physical. A wife who attracted devoted knights brought prestige to her household. Her husband demonstrated his sophistication by allowing courtly devotion, while trusting the system's rules would prevent actual adultery. Of course, this didn't always work. Historical records reveal numerous adultery scandals disguised as refined love. The lines blurred frequently. When Eleanor of Aquitaine held courts of love at Poitiers around 1170, nobles would debate questions like, "Can true love exist in marriage?" The answer was generally no. Her husband Henry II was reportedly unamused, suspecting these theoretical discussions provided cover for actual affairs. The geographical spread tells us everything. Courtly love flourished in southern France, spread through Eleanor's influence to England, reached Germany through mini-song traditions, influenced Italian poetry, including Dante's idealization of Beatrice, but it remained primarily an aristocratic phenomenon. Peasants courted, married, and loved without these elaborate rituals. Courtly love was a luxury for people with enough leisure time, education, and social refinement to play complicated emotional games. For a farmer, love meant partnership, shared labor, and children, not suffering poetically over someone you could never have. The poor simply couldn't afford to waste time on relationships designed never to be consummated. By the 14th century, courtly love began to seem ridiculous to new generations. Writers like Chaucer gently mocked its conventions in the Canterbury Tales, particularly in The Knight's Tale, where two knights fight over a woman who doesn't particularly want either of them. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and changing social structures made elaborate romantic games seem frivolous. Reality had become harsh enough without inventing additional suffering for entertainment. The Renaissance brought different ideals: humanist emphasis on companionate marriage, Protestant rejection of Catholic courtly traditions, and growing skepticism about suffering as spiritually purifying. Yet courtly love's legacy is paradoxical. It elevated women to positions of power within its framework. They were the judges, the grail to be quested after, the source of moral refinement, but it also objectified them, turning real women into symbols and abstractions. The idea that love should be difficult, that obstacles make it more valuable, that suffering proves devotion, these concepts echo through Western romance to this day. The friend zone, the valorization of unrequited love in pop songs, the romantic hero who pines rather than moving on, all descendants of courtly love. Even our wedding traditions reflect it. The bride's father giving her away, she's the prize. The groom's devotion proving his worth, he's the questing knight. Courtly love invented the template for romantic longing that still shapes how we tell love stories, even though we've completely inverted its core purpose by making consummation the goal rather than the forbidden outcome. We've kept the suffering and the obstacles and the dramatic devotion, but thrown out the part where you're never supposed to actually get the person you want. Modern love is courtly love, with the safety removed. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider this strange medieval invention, a love system that valued wanting over having, worshipped from afar rather than partnering up close, and found meaning in permanent unfulfillment. Perhaps they understood something we've forgotten, that anticipation is sometimes sweeter than fulfillment, that obstacles can intensify feeling, or perhaps they just needed something to do in drafty castles during long winters. Either way, rest well knowing modern love at least allows you to be together. Picture medieval Europe around 1150, stone castles rising from muddy courtyards, where knights clanked through halls that smelled of wood smoke and wet wool. In these rough places, something extraordinary was being born. The troubadours of southern France were inventing a new kind of love, one that would seem utterly foreign to us today. They called it fin d'amour, refined love. We know it as courtly love, and it came with one unbreakable rule that would change romance forever. Here's what made courtly love revolutionary. It wasn't about marriage. It wasn't about starting a family or joining two estates. Knights would choose a lady, almost always someone else's wife, someone of higher rank than themselves, and declare themselves her devoted servant. They would write poetry for her, fight tournaments in her colors, suffer dramatically over their hopeless passion. And here's the crucial part: the love could never ever be consummated. That was the entire point. Andreas Capellanus wrote the rule book around 1185, 31 laws that read like instructions for an elaborate game. Rule 12. A true lover is constantly obsessed by the image of his beloved. Rule 14. Easy attainment makes love worthless. Difficult attainment makes it valuable. These weren't guidelines, they were commandments. The system was built on obstacles, longing, and permanent unfulfillment. Desire was the fuel, but satisfaction would destroy everything they were trying to create. Imagine watching this unfold in a great hall, tapestries hanging from stone walls, candles flickering in iron sconces. A knight approaches his chosen lady during the evening meal. He wears her ribbon tied to his sleeve. His eyes never leave her face as he recites verses he spent weeks perfecting. She listens with polite distance, granting him a small smile, perhaps a word of thanks. The entire court watches this performance, judging whether both players follow the rules correctly. The poetry that survives tells us everything about their psychology. Bernard de Ventadorn wrote around 1150, "I am like Narcissus, who gazed at himself in the mirror of the well. I am so lost in thought I dare not speak." He's comparing his unrequited love to Narcissus's self-destructive obsession and calling it wisdom. Another troubadour, Joffre Rudel, claimed to love a woman he'd never even met. The The suffering itself was the achievement, the longing was the goal. But what did the women think about all this? The Countess of Dia, one of the few female troubadours, gives us a clue. Around 1175 she wrote, "I've been in great anguish over a knight I once loved. I want everyone to know that I loved him too much. Now I see I'm betrayed because I didn't give him my love." She's pointing out the absurdity. Withholding physical love to maintain the game brought her genuine suffering without any of the supposed spiritual benefits. The husbands, many actually tolerated their wives' courtly love relationships. These were understood to be performative, not physical. A wife who attracted devoted knights brought prestige to her household. Her husband could demonstrate his sophistication by allowing courtly devotion while trusting the system's rules would prevent actual adultery. Of course, this didn't always work. Historical records reveal numerous scandals where the lines between performance and reality blurred completely. Eleanor of Aquitaine held courts of love at Poitiers around 1170. Nobles would gather to debate questions like, can true love exist in marriage? The answer was generally no. These weren't just intellectual exercises. They were creating a whole new framework for understanding desire. Her husband Henry II was reportedly less than amused. Suspecting these theoretical discussions provided convenient cover for actual affairs happening right under his nose. This system spread like wildfire across medieval Europe, from southern France to Henry II's English court, through Eleanor's influence, to Germany, where they called it minisang, to Italy, where Dante would idealize his Beatrice. But notice something important. This remained purely aristocratic. Peasants courted, married, and loved without elaborate rituals. They didn't have time for complicated emotional games. For farmers, love meant partnership, shared labor, children, not suffering poetically over someone you could never have. Picture a tournament in 1200, knights thundering toward each other with lances, each wearing his lady's colors. The crowd cheers as Sir Geoffrey unherses his opponent, in honor of Lady Marguerite, who sits in the stands next to her husband, watching with polite appreciation. After the victory, Geoffrey kneels before her. She grants him permission to kiss her hand. The husband nods approvingly. Everyone understands the rules of this strange theatre they've created. Desire performed safely within marriage. But why did courtly love emerge when it did? Medieval nobility lived in a brutal world where marriages were business arrangements. A noble woman had no say in whom she married. Once wed, she became her husband's property under law. Knights were professional warriors, often landless younger sons with little prospect of marriage. Courtly love gave both groups something precious, a space where women held power as judges and inspiration, where knights could experience elevated emotion beyond simple violence. The geography of courtly love tells its own story. It flourished in the warm courts of Provence and Aquitaine, spread to the colder castles of northern France and England, took root in German courts along the Rhine. Each region adapted the rules to local customs, but the core remained the same: idealized love, public performance, permanent separation between desire and fulfillment. It was a luxury for people with enough leisure time, education, and social refinement to play complicated emotional games. By the 14th century, something had changed. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population. The 100 Years' War brought new kinds of brutality. Social structures shifted as money became more important than bloodlines. Suddenly, elaborate romantic games seemed frivolous. Writers like Chaucer began gently mocking courtly love conventions, particularly in The Knight's Tale, where two knights fight over a woman who doesn't particularly want either of them. The Renaissance brought different ideals. Humanist thinkers emphasized companionate marriage based on mutual affection. Protestant reformers rejected Catholic courtly traditions, growing skepticism about suffering as spiritually purifying. Yet courtly love's DNA survived in surprising ways. The idea that love should be difficult, that obstacles make it more valuable, that suffering proves devotion. Listen to any pop song about unrequited love. You're hearing echoes of 12th century troubadours singing in drafty castle halls. Courtly love's legacy remains paradoxical. It elevated women to positions of power within its framework. They were the judges, the source of moral refinement, the grail to be quested after. Yet it also objectified them, turning real women into symbols and abstractions. The friend zone, the romantic hero who pines rather than moves on, the worship of distant celebrities, all descendants of a medieval system that valued wanting over having, longing over partnership. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this strange medieval invention that found beauty in permanent unfulfillment. Perhaps they understood something we've forgotten. That anticipation is sometimes sweeter than satisfaction, that obstacles can intensify feeling, that some forms of love exist best when they remain just out of reach. Or perhaps they just needed something to do in drafty castles during long winters. Either way, rest knowing modern love allows you to actually be with the person you adore. Chapter 3. Society and Marriage in Medieval Europe. Picture this. A young woman, maybe 15 years old, standing in a stone chamber in 1247. She's wearing her finest dress, silk imported from Constantinople, probably worth more than a village makes in a year. Tomorrow she'll marry a man she met 3 days ago. Her father chose him for his army, his lands, his political connections. Love? That's not even part of the conversation. This was marriage among medieval nobility, a business transaction wrapped in ceremony. Medieval Europe wasn't gentle with women. Under law, once married, a woman became her husband's property. Her dowry, her lands, even her body, all his to control. She couldn't own property, couldn't make contracts, couldn't even leave without permission. The wedding ring wasn't just jewelry, it was a shackle made of gold. Noble families used their daughters like chess pieces, moving them around the board to secure alliances, prevent wars, or claim new territories. Personal happiness, that was a luxury they couldn't afford. Marriage contracts were thick documents that read like business deals. How much land would change hands? What armies would be pledged? Which trade routes would open up? A typical contract from 1289 might specify that the bride brings 2 castles, 300 serfs, and annual rents worth £50 of silver. The groom promises military service for 40 days each year. Children from the union would inherit specific titles. The actual wedding ceremony. That was just the paperwork getting signed in public. Knights lived in a different kind of trap. Most were younger sons, second, third, fourth sons who inherited nothing. Their older brothers got the castles, the lands, the titles. These landless knights had to make their own way in the world through sword and service. Marriage was their only path to property. But first they had to prove themselves worthy. This meant years of fighting in tournaments, going on crusades, or serving other lords, hoping to catch the attention of someone with a marriageable daughter. The great halls of medieval castles were stages for elaborate performances of courtesy. Everyone knew the script by heart, how to bow, when to speak, which fork to use for which course. Men wore their finest clothes, spoke in flowery language, and pretended to be civilized, but violence always lurked just beneath the surface. A wrong word, a perceived insult, a slight at dinner, and swords would come out. The same men who wrote love poetry would split each other's skulls over matters of honor. Court life was brutal theatre. Picture a feast in 1273, hundreds of candles casting shadows on stone walls, servants carrying platters of roasted peacock and wine in golden cups. The nobility sits arranged by rank, every seat a statement of power. Conversations are weapons wrapped in silk. A duke praises another lord's wife just a bit too warmly. Smiles freeze, hands drift toward sword hilts. By morning, someone might be dead over what sounded like a compliment. Courtesy was a thin layer over constant danger. Women learned to navigate this world through careful observation and strategic silence. They watched their mothers, their aunts, their older sisters, memorizing which topics were safe, which men were dangerous, how to deflect unwanted attention without causing offense. A noble lady might speak 5 languages, play 3 musical instruments, and embroider with perfect precision, all while calculating which alliance would benefit her family most. Beauty was a weapon, education was armor, and pregnancy was both triumph and trap. Teenage girls were married off as soon as they could bear children. 13, 14, 15 years old, still playing with dolls one day, pregnant the next. The mortality rate for childbirth was terrifying. Maybe 1 in 10 women died giving birth, sometimes more. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice with death. Noble families needed heirs, but each attempt might kill the mother. Women who survived multiple births were considered blessed by God, or just extraordinarily lucky. The Catholic Church shaped everything about medieval marriage. Divorce was nearly impossible, only annulment, and only for very specific reasons, too closely related by blood. Annulment, one party already married. Annulment, forced into marriage, maybe annulment, if you could prove it and had enough money for bribes. But if you were just miserable, just beaten, just unloved, too bad. Marriage was a sacrament, permanent as baptism. Death was the only escape most couples had from unhappy unions. Knights without land lived like well-dressed beggars. They'd travel from castle to castle, tournament to tournament, hoping for hospitality and a chance to impress someone important. Their horses and armor were their only possessions and their tickets to survival. A knight who lost his warhorse in battle might starve. These men were desperate for marriage, for land, for a future that didn't depend on other people's charity. Their hunger made them dangerous and sometimes very romantic. Noble households were small armies. A duke might have 200 people living in his castle: knights, squires, servants, craftsmen, clerks, musicians, and hangers-on. Everyone competed for the lord's attention and favour. Gossip spread like plague through these crowded spaces. Who was sleeping with whom? Which knight was plotting against which? Who had fallen from grace? A single rumour could destroy a reputation or start a war. Privacy was impossible when 200 people shared the same roof. Marriage ceremonies were public spectacles designed to show off wealth and power. The bride's dress might cost more than most people earned in a lifetime: cloth of gold, pearls sewn into the sleeves, a train that required 6 pages to carry. The feast afterward could last for days. Whole forests of deer would be hunted, barrels of wine from France, spices from the East Indies. The wedding wasn't about the couple, it was about displaying the family's resources to friends and enemies alike. Some women found ways to gain power within this system. Widows especially. If they survived their husbands and inherited property, they could choose their own second marriages, or refuse to remarry at all. Eleanor of Aquitaine divorced one king and married another, controlling vast territories in her own right. Matilda of Tuscany commanded armies and negotiated with popes. These were exceptional women who turned the rules to their advantage, but they were rare exceptions in a world designed to control them. The reality behind medieval romance was often ugly. Domestic violence was common and legal. A husband could beat his wife as long as he didn't kill her. Rape within marriage wasn't even a concept. Wives were property, existing for their husband's use. Many marriages were essentially legalized slavery, with women trapped in homes with men who saw them as possessions. The flowery poetry and courtly manners were performances that covered up a social system built on the subjugation of women. Yet somehow, within this harsh system, genuine love occasionally bloomed. Letters survive from couples who found real affection despite arranged marriages. John of Gaunt wrote tender notes to his wife. Some noble women left records of grief when their husbands died in battle. Love might not have been the reason for marriage, but it sometimes grew anyway, like flowers pushing through cracks in stone walls. These glimpses of tenderness make the system even more tragic, showing what might have been. This was the world that created courtly love, a system where real marriage was business, real women were possessions, and real knights were desperate for land and status. No wonder they invented elaborate fantasies about impossible love, unreachable ladies, and noble suffering. When actual relationships were transactions, when women were traded like cattle, when men fought constantly for scraps of property, perhaps the only safe place for romance was in poetry and dreams. Tomorrow, we'll explore how they built those beautiful, impossible dreams. Picture southern France in the 1100s. Stone castles rising from vineyard hills. Inside these courts, something revolutionary was happening. Troubadours were inventing a new kind of love, one with a shocking rule. The knight could never ever touch the woman he adored. This wasn't tragedy, this was the entire point. They called it fanama, refined love. We know it as courtly love, and it was about to change everything we think romance means. Aquitaine and Provence, these weren't just regions on a map. They were laboratories of longing. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court at Poitiers buzzed with poet-musicians who understood something profound about desire. They knew that wanting something you can't have burns differently than getting what you wish for, so they built an entire romantic system around that burning. Knights would serve married ladies with absolute devotion, knowing fulfillment would destroy the magic. The word itself tells the story. Fin amour, refined love. Not the rough passion of marriage beds or tavern encounters. This was love as art form, love as spiritual discipline. A knight would choose his lady, usually someone else's wife, always someone beyond his reach. Then he'd spend years writing poetry about her eyebrows, her laugh, the way she held her embroidery, years of beautiful, deliberate frustration, years of becoming better than he was. The rules were surprisingly specific. Andreas Capellanus wrote them down around 1185, 31 commandments for lovers. Number 12 still makes you pause. A true lover is constantly obsessed by the image of his beloved, Number 13 cuts deeper. Love increased by being difficult to obtain. They weren't discovering love, they were engineering it, creating a machine that ran on obstacles, powered by the one thing that never ran out, wanting what you couldn't have. Watch how it worked in practice. A young knight spots a countess at court. Married, untouchable, perfect. He approaches not with flowers but with a poem. She listens, considers, then grants him the smallest possible favor, permission to wear her colors at the tournament. Nothing more. He rides out wearing her ribbon like a sacred relic, knowing those silk threads represent the closest he'll ever get to touching her skin. The distance was the prize. The poetry they wrote reveals everything about their psychology. Bernard de Ventadorn compared himself to Narcissus, the mythical youth who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring at something he could never possess. But Bernard called this wisdom, not madness. I am so lost in thought. I dare not speak, he wrote. But in this I have the mien of a wise man, since I love the one most fair, suffering as enlightenment. Some troubadours took it even further. Joffre Rudel claimed to love a woman he'd never met, the Countess of Tripoli, thousands of miles away. He called it amour de longue, distant love. He wrote song after song about this phantom woman, built his entire identity around longing for someone who might not even exist. Whether she was real didn't matter. The ache in his chest when he sang her name, that was real enough. But what about the women? Their voices come through more rarely, filtered through male scribes and courtly expectations. The Countess of Dia, one of the few female troubadours, wrote with sharp honesty about the game's cost. I've been in great anguish over a knight I once loved. Now I see I'm betrayed because I didn't give him my love. She understood the trap. Withhold yourself. Lose him. Give yourself. Break the rules that made it special. The husbands. Many encouraged their wives' courtly admirers. A woman who attracted devoted knights brought prestige to the household. It showed your wife was desirable, your court sophisticated, your understanding of refined love complete. The key was trust in the system's rules. As long as everyone played their parts correctly, as long as desire remained safely unconsummated, these elaborate romantic friendships enhanced rather than threatened marriage. Usually, of course, the lines blurred constantly. History is littered with courtly love affairs that became actual love affairs. When Eleanor of Aquitaine held courts of love at Poitiers, debating questions like, can true love exist in marriage? Her husband Henry II grew suspicious. These theoretical discussions provided perfect cover for real passion. The difference between performing desire and feeling it was sometimes thinner than parchment. Some knights played the game too well. The geographic spread tells its own story. From Provence to Poitiers, from Eleanor's court in England to the Minisang traditions of Germany, courtly love travelled with the nobility. Dante idealized Beatrice through its lens. Italian poets refined its language. But notice who stayed out of the game. Peasants, merchants, anyone whose love had to result in partnership, shared labor, children, survival. Courtly love was a luxury for people with leisure time for beautiful suffering. The system had its own internal logic. If marriage was about property, lineage and political alliance, if physical desire was common, animal, available, then where was the space for something higher? Courtly love carved out that space. It said desire could be noble if it stayed desire. Longing could be sacred if it stayed longing. The very impossibility was what made it worthy of a knight's devotion, a poet's song, a lady's careful attention. By the 1300s, younger generations were starting to roll their eyes. Chaucer gently mocked courtly love in the Canterbury Tales. His Knight's Tale features two men fighting desperately over a woman who doesn't particularly want either of them. The Black Death had killed a third of Europe. Wars raged. Elaborate romantic games seemed frivolous when survival required partnership, not performance. Reality was pushing back against refined fantasy. Yet something survived. The idea that love should be difficult, that obstacles make it more valuable, that suffering proves devotion. Listen to modern love songs, read romance novels, watch movies about the one who got away. We've inverted courtly love's purpose, made consummation the goal instead of the forbidden outcome. But we kept its emotional architecture, the template for romantic longing, built in those medieval courts, still shapes our hearts tonight. Courtly love elevated women to judges and prizes, while simultaneously turning them into symbols rather than people. It valued wanting over having, worship over partnership, distance over intimacy. To modern minds it sounds like elaborate torture. Yet within its strange rules was an attempt to create beauty from desire itself, to find meaning in the space between reaching and touching. Perhaps they understood something we've forgotten about: the sweetness of anticipation. As you drift towards sleep, consider this medieval paradox: a love designed never to be fulfilled, a desire crafted to remain desire. Those troubadours in their stone courts knew something about the human heart. Sometimes the wanting is sweeter than the having. Sometimes the most precious things are the ones that stay just out of reach. Rest well, knowing modern love allows you to actually hold the person you adore. That's progress the troubadours never imagined. The rules were written down, actually written down, like instructions for a board game. Around 1185, a cleric named Andreas Capellanus compiled 31 specific rules for courtly love in his treatise, The Art of Courtly Love. These weren't suggestions, they were commandments for how nobles should conduct their elaborate romantic performances. Rule number 1 might surprise you. Marriage is no excuse for not loving someone else. Andreas wasn't making this up as he went along. He was documenting a system already flourishing in the courts of France. His rules read like a manual for emotional torture, carefully disguised as refinement. Rule 14 states that easy attainment makes love worthless, difficult attainment makes it precious. They had turned romantic suffering into a science, complete with methodology. Consider Rule 23. A true lover is constantly obsessed by the image of his beloved, not sometimes thinking about her, constantly obsessed. This wasn't healthy devotion. This was cultivated mental illness, dressed up as nobility. Knights were expected to lose sleep, lose appetite, lose their ability to function normally. The more they suffered, the more refined they became. The game required an audience. Courtly love wasn't conducted in private. It was performed in great halls, during feasts, at tournaments where hundreds watched. A knight would publicly declare his devotion to a married lady, wear her colours in combat, dedicate his victories to her name. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone judged whether both parties played correctly. The lady held all the power within this system. She could grant small favours, a ribbon from her dress, permission to kiss her hand, a kind word in public, but she could never give herself. The moment she did, the game ended. Her role was to inspire suffering while remaining forever out of reach. She was the grail that must never be obtained. Rule number 13 fascinated medieval audiences. When made public, love rarely endures. The system demanded publicity while claiming secrecy made love stronger. This contradiction was intentional. The performance required witnesses, but true passion supposedly flourished in shadow. They had created a love that could only exist in the space between public and private, never fully either. What about the husbands? Many actually encouraged their wives' courtly love relationships. A wife who attracted devoted knights brought prestige to the household. Her husband demonstrated his sophistication by allowing the performance while trusting the system's rules would prevent actual adultery. Trust was built into the architecture of the game itself, but the lines blurred constantly. Historical records reveal numerous adultery scandals disguised as courtly love. The system provided perfect cover for actual affairs. Who could tell the difference between performed passion and real desire? The rules created plausible deniability, while making genuine connection almost impossible to distinguish from elaborate pretense. Andreas included a curious detail. Lovers must turn pale in each other's presence. Not blush, turn pale. They were supposed to become physically ill from proximity to their beloved. The system demanded visible suffering as proof of authentic feeling. Love was measured by how much damage it inflicted on the lover's body and mind. Rule 31 was perhaps the most telling. Nothing forbids one woman from being loved by many men, or one man from loving many women. The system wasn't about exclusive pair bonding. It was about creating multiple sources of beautiful suffering throughout the court. Jealousy wasn't a problem to solve. It was fuel for the engine. The rules explicitly stated that jealousy increases love's value, not destroys it, increases it. Modern psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive pattern possible. Medieval courts had stumbled onto the exact formula that makes slot machines irresistible, and they applied it to human hearts with devastating precision. Women occasionally broke character. The Countess of Dia, one of the few female troubadours, wrote bitterly about the system's absurdities. She suffered genuine grief by following the rules, withholding physical love to maintain the game. Her poetry reveals the human cost of turning real emotions into performance art. Andreas included detailed instructions for courts of love, actual tribunals where nobles would debate romantic questions. Can true love exist in marriage? Should a knight serve a lady who shows interest in another? These weren't hypothetical discussions. They were legal proceedings for emotional disputes, complete with judges and formal verdicts. Eleanor of Aquitaine held the most famous courts of love at Poitiers around 1170. Nobles would present complex romantic scenarios for judgment. The verdicts became precedents for future cases. They had created an entire legal system for managing unrequited love, complete with appeals processes and binding decisions. The game required constant escalation. Once a knight mastered basic suffering, he needed to find new ways to prove his devotion. Some claimed to love women they had never met, distant love across kingdoms. Others vowed to perform impossible quests. The system demanded increasingly elaborate demonstrations of hopelessness. By the 14th century, younger generations found the rules ridiculous. Writers like Chaucer mocked courtly love's conventions mercilessly. The Black Death made elaborate romantic games seem frivolous when real love meant staying alive together. The age of beautiful suffering was ending, but its rules had already rewired how Western culture thinks about desire. Picture a tournament ground in 1180. Sir Gawain rides into the lists wearing azure blue ribbons, the exact shade favoured by Lady Marguerite, wife to the Count of Provence. Everyone knows, the crowd murmurs recognition as he takes his position, his devotion announced not through words but through colour. This was how courtly love worked in practice, not in secret chambers or hidden gardens, but here, in bright sunlight, with hundreds watching every gesture, every choice, every public declaration of impossible devotion. The selection process followed unspoken rules. A knight couldn't simply choose any lady, she had to outrank him socially, preferably by a significant margin. A landless younger son might serve a countess. A minor baron might worship a duchess, but never the reverse. The hierarchy had to be preserved, and she had to be married. Single ladies were for actual courtship leading to marriage. Courtly love required impossibility. The married state provided the perfect permanent obstacle that made the entire system function. Lady Eleanor sits in her bower, reading aloud from a new poem. Sir Bertrand has sent verses comparing her eyes to morning stars, her voice to angels singing. She reads with perfect composure, neither pleased nor displeased, simply gracious. Her ladies-in-waiting listen carefully, evaluating her performance. Too much enthusiasm would be unseemly, too little would be cruel. She must thread the needle exactly, accepting devotion without encouraging impropriety, maintaining dignity while acknowledging the knight's artistic effort and public suffering. The great hall buzzes with conversation about Sir Marcus. 3 times this month he's approached Lady Catherine's table after dinner, each time requesting permission to recite new verses. Each time she's granted exactly 2 minutes, no more. The court watches these interactions like theatre critics, noting how he kneels, how she holds her head, whether her smile reaches her eyes. Everyone has opinions. Is he too forward? Is she too cold? These relationships were community entertainment, judged by audiences who understood the rules. The poetry reveals the psychology. Listen to Bernard de Ventadorn. Around 1150, I am dying of desire, and mortal pain comes to me from love. But then, yet I would not wish to be cured of loving, for never have I been in such sweet pain. Sweet pain, he's describing suffering as pleasure, longing as achievement. This wasn't masochism, it was spiritual exercise. The knight was supposed to be improved by unrequited love, refined through endless wanting, made noble through beautiful suffering. Small favours carried enormous weight. A lady might allow her devoted knight to carry her handkerchief into battle, or permit him to kiss her hand in public rather than merely bowing. She might grant him the privilege of walking beside her in the garden, but always with attendants present. These tiny gestures were precious currency in the courtly love economy. Too many favours too quickly cheapened the relationship, too few seemed heartless. The lady had to portion out hope in carefully measured doses. The tournaments became stages for elaborate romantic theatre. Sir Geoffrey rides wearing Lady Anne's colours, azure and gold ribbons streaming from his lance. When he falls in the second pass, the crowd watches her reaction. She remains composed, perhaps allowing concern to flicker briefly across her face. Later, she'll send word through her lady-in-waiting, inquiring after his health, hoping his injuries aren't serious. Never directly, never privately, always through proper channels, always with witnesses, always maintaining the performance. The husbands navigated this carefully. Count Robert knows Sir William writes poetry to his wife, knows William wears her colours at tournaments, knows the whole court talks about their courtly love relationship. But this is acceptable, even prestigious. His wife attracts devoted knights because she's worthy of devotion. As long as the rules are followed, as long as everything stays public, performative, properly distant, he can afford to be magnanimous. It demonstrates his sophistication and her desirability simultaneously, but evaluation cut both ways. The lady faced judgment too. Was she too encouraging? Too discouraging? The Countess Marie, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, established actual courts of love at Poitiers around 1170, formal tribunals where nobles would debate romantic questions. If a lady grants her love too easily, does it lose value? The answer was always yes. Ladies were expected to be difficult but not impossible, gracious but not warm, aware of their devoted knights without being moved by them. The performances required remarkable emotional control. Sir Rowland has loved Lady Isabel from afar for 3 years. Today she's announced her husband's death. She's now a widow, theoretically available for actual courtship. But Rowland faces a dilemma. If he immediately shifts from courtly lover to marriage suitor, he reveals that his devotion was ultimately selfish, aimed at possession rather than pure service. True courtly love should continue even when circumstances change. The court watches to see what he'll do. Female voices reveal the system's contradictions. The Countess of Dia, one of the few recorded female troubadours, wrote around 1175, "I've been in great anguish over a knight I once loved, and I want everyone to know that I loved him too much. Now I see I'm betrayed because I didn't give him my love." She's describing the impossible bind, withhold physical love to maintain courtly love's rules, but risk losing the man entirely to someone less bound by convention. The audience was everything. In the great hall at Poitiers, Lady Eleanor holds court while 3 knights compete for her attention through increasingly elaborate verses. She listens to each with identical gracious attention, giving nothing away. But the watchers see everything. Which knight makes her pause slightly before responding? Whose poetry makes her ladies-in-waiting exchange meaningful glances? Who manages to make her laugh despite herself? The performance was for her, but also for everyone watching the performance. Geographic differences emerged. In Germany, the Minnesang tradition emphasized spiritual purification through love, the knight becoming worthy of his lady through devoted service. In Italy, poets like Guido Guinizelli developed the sweet new style, making the beloved a path to divine understanding. In France, it remained more playful, more social, a sophisticated game with serious emotional stakes, but lighter spiritual pretensions. Each culture adapted courtly love to its own values, while maintaining the core impossibility. The system's flaws were obvious to many participants. Some knights grew tired of eternal suffering and sought actual relationships. Some ladies preferred genuine affection to performative worship. Some husbands grew suspicious despite the theoretical safeguards. Scandals erupted when courtly love became cover for actual adultery, when the performance collapsed into reality. The chronicles record numerous cases where pure devotion led to very impure consequences, revealing the artificial nature of the entire enterprise. By 1300, the game was changing. Younger nobles found courtly love increasingly artificial, preferring more direct romantic approaches, or marriages based on genuine compatibility. The Black Death made elaborate emotional games seem frivolous when survival was uncertain. New literary forms mocked courtly love's conventions, writers like Chaucer gently ridiculing knights who fought over women who didn't particularly want either of them. The performance was becoming harder to maintain as society itself transformed. Yet something beautiful emerged from all this artifice. These elaborate performances created spaces where emotion could be explored safely, where desire could be acknowledged without destroying social order. Knights learned to express feelings through poetry rather than violence. Ladies exercised subtle power within rigid hierarchies. Both participated in something that elevated daily life into art, turning basic human longing into refined emotional theatre. The system was artificial, but the feelings it generated, those were startlingly, unexpectedly real. The troubadours understood something we've forgotten, that words could make longing more beautiful than fulfillment ever could be. In the courts of 12th century France, poets transformed unrequited love into an art form. They wrote verses about women they'd never touch, knights who'd never win their ladies, and hearts that found strange joy in permanent ache. Tonight we explore how medieval poets turned romantic suffering into the most exquisite poetry Europe had ever heard. Picture a troubadour in Eleanor of Aquitaine's court. Around 1170, his lute catches candlelight as he sings of impossible love. The assembled nobles lean forward, recognizing their own secret longings in his words. These weren't simple love songs. They were psychological maps of desire, teaching aristocrats how to feel refined emotions. The troubadours had discovered that describing love could be more powerful than experiencing it. Poetry became their laboratory for exploring the human heart. Bernard de Ventadorn, perhaps the greatest troubadour, made a startling comparison around 1150. He likened himself to Narcissus, that doomed youth who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring into water. But Bernard called this wisdom, not folly. "I seem to myself a fool when I look upon her," he wrote, "but in this I have the mien of a wise man, since I love the one most fair." Self-destruction had become self-actualization. Think about what Bernard was really saying. He's admitting his love is as hopeless as Narcissus, gazing at an unreachable image. Yet he calls himself wise for choosing the most beautiful, most impossible woman to adore. The troubadours had inverted normal logic. Where others saw romantic failure, they saw spiritual achievement. Suffering wasn't something to escape, it was something to cultivate, to refine, to transform into verses that would outlast kingdoms. But Bernard's comparison goes deeper than simple unrequited love. Narcissus died because he couldn't possess his own reflection, couldn't bridge the gap between desire and fulfillment. Bernard suggests the courtly lover experiences the same impossible longing, but finds transcendence in that very impossibility. The mirror becomes metaphor. The lady isn't just herself. She's a reflection of the knight's highest aspirations, forever beautiful, forever just out of reach. Then there was Joffre Ruel, who took impossible love to its logical extreme. Around 1140, he claimed to adore the Countess of Tripoli, a woman he'd never met, living in the distant Crusader states. His amour de longue, distant love, became legendary. He wrote, "Never shall I enjoy love unless I enjoy this distant love, for I know no gentler or better woman, not near or far, than this one." Geography itself had become his romantic obstacle. Legend says Joffre finally sailed to Tripoli to meet his distant beloved and died in her arms upon arrival, overwhelmed by the reality of what had been pure imagination. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential about courtly love poetry. These poets weren't really writing about women. They were writing about the experience of wanting itself. Distance wasn't a problem to solve. It was the entire point. Listen to how Joffre describes his distant love. "All other joys are nothing compared to this one, for the happiness of distant love is the finest of all." He's found bliss in separation, ecstasy in impossibility. The Countess of Tripoli might not have even existed, but his feelings for her were absolutely real. Medieval poets had discovered that imagination could create emotions as intense as any physical relationship, perhaps more intense. What made these poets different from modern romantic writers was their embrace of suffering as virtue. They didn't write about love to seduce or to win their ladies. They wrote to perfect their own souls through beautiful agony. Each verse was a prayer, each stanza a step towards spiritual refinement. The lady became almost Christ-like, a figure whose very unattainability offered salvation through devoted service. The psychology behind this poetry is fascinating. These were often landless knights, younger sons with little prospect of marriage or inheritance. Courtly love poetry offered them a way to transform their exclusion into elegance. They couldn't have the woman, the castle, the secure future, but they could have the most refined feelings, the most beautiful words, the most noble suffering. Poetry became their aristocracy of the heart. Consider the recurring images in troubadour poetry: mirrors, distant shores, unreachable towers, closed gardens. These weren't random metaphors, they were psychological landscapes. The mirror reflects but cannot be touched. The distant shore promises but demands a perilous journey. The tower elevates but isolates. Each image captures the essential dynamic of courtly love, beauty that maintains its power precisely through its inaccessibility. The troubadours also revolutionized how poetry could capture internal experience. Earlier medieval literature focused on external action, battles, quests, heroic deeds. But courtly love poets turned inward, mapping every nuance of longing, hope, despair, and joy. They invented a vocabulary for feelings that had existed but never been so precisely articulated. Their verses became mirrors for anyone who had ever loved hopelessly. What's remarkable is how these poets influenced each other across generations and regions. Bernard de Ventadorn's Narcissus imagery echoed through decades of subsequent verse. Joffre Ruel's distant love inspired countless imitations. They were creating a shared language of romantic impossibility, teaching each other and their audiences how to transform ordinary longing into extraordinary art. Poetry became a school for refined feeling. The ladies who inspired this poetry remain largely mysterious. We have their names: Azalea, Ermengarde, the Countess of Tripoli, but rarely their own words. They exist in these verses as idealized figures, perfect and untouchable. Yet perhaps that was the point. Real women, with real personalities and flaws, would have complicated the pure geometry of desire that made this poetry possible. Fantasy allowed for perfect love. By the 13th century, courtly love poetry had spread throughout Europe, each region adding its own variations. German Minnesinger, Italian poets, English court musicians, all explored the same themes of noble suffering and beautiful impossibility. The troubadours had created a template for romantic expression that would influence Western literature for centuries. Every love song since owes something to their innovations in transforming longing into art. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider what these medieval poets understood: that some of our most powerful emotions exist in the space between desire and fulfillment. They found beauty in barriers, meaning in distance, transcendence in impossibility. Perhaps they knew something we've forgotten: that wanting can sometimes be more beautiful than having. Their verses survive while their loves remain forever distant, forever perfect. Here's what medieval men never wanted you to know about courtly love. The women themselves thought it was absurd. While troubadours composed elaborate verses about distant devotion and noble suffering, the few female voices that survived tell a different story entirely. They saw through the romantic facade to something more troubling: a system that demanded they withhold love to maintain a game that benefited everyone except them. Tonight, we hear their whispers of rebellion. The Countess of Dia stands alone in medieval literature, one of perhaps 20 female troubadours whose work survived the centuries. Writing around 1175 in Provence, she had a name, though history forgot it. What remains is her voice, sharp, frustrated, cutting through courtly love's pretty lies. She wrote about a knight she'd loved, and her words carry a weight that male troubadours' fantasies never possessed. This was real experience, not romantic performance. Listen to her frustration. "I've been in great anguish over a knight I once loved, and I want everyone to know that I loved him too much. Now I see I'm betrayed because I didn't give him my love." She's pointing out the system's cruel contradiction. Follow the rules, remain distant, maintain the game, and suffer genuine heartbreak for no spiritual benefit. The promise of refinement through denial had left her empty, aching. She continues, "I've suffered much grief over it in bed, and dressed." This isn't poetic suffering for public display. This is a woman lying awake at night, tormented by a system that demanded she reject the man she loved to preserve some abstract ideal of noble restraint. The male troubadours romanticized this pain. She lived it. She knew the difference between performance and genuine anguish that served no purpose. Other female voices, rare as they are, echo her skepticism. Marie de France, writing in England around 1160, created Les short narrative poems where courtly love consistently brings disaster. Her women suffer not from noble longing, but from a system that denies them agency. In her world, elaborate romantic games lead to genuine tragedy, not spiritual elevation. Her stories feel like warnings disguised as entertainment. Consider the impossible position these women occupied. As the objects of courtly devotion, they held power within the game, but only if they never used it. They could grant small favors, judge between competing suitors, command devotion from multiple knights, but the moment they acted on genuine feeling, reciprocated real affection, or chose their own partner, the system collapsed. Their power existed only through permanent self-denial. The performance demanded everything. In public, these women played their roles perfectly: gracious but distant, kind but unavailable, inspiring but untouchable. They praised knights' verses, accepted their service, wore their colors with appropriate dignity, but private letters that survived reveal different feelings: frustration at being symbols rather than people, longing for genuine partnership rather than worshipful distance. The mask grew heavy. Marriage complicated everything further. Courtly love explicitly stated that true affection couldn't exist within marriage. Marriage was political arrangement. Love was spiritual elevation. But this meant married women could engage in courtly relationships while remaining faithful wives. The theory sounds neat. The reality was emotional chaos. Women juggling arranged marriages, courtly admirers, and their own buried desires for authentic connection. Some women found ways to navigate this maze. They used courtly love's rules to gain influence over men who otherwise controlled their lives. By granting or withholding favour, they could manipulate political alliances, reward loyalty, punish slights. Eleanor of Aquitaine turned her courts of love into centres of real power, but even she paid a price. Her emotional autonomy, sacrificed to maintain political advantage. The objectification was subtle but complete. Courtly love claimed to honour women, elevated them to positions of moral authority, made them the source of knights' spiritual improvement, but it also reduced them to symbols, prizes to be won through proper devotion, mirrors reflecting male virtue rather than independent beings with their own desires. They were simultaneously worshipped and erased, powerful and powerless. Some women subverted the system from within. They chose their favourites not based on poetic skill or devotion, but on genuine attraction. They granted private audiences that went beyond courtly propriety. They wrote their own rules, quietly defying a system that demanded their compliance. These rebellions rarely made it into official records, but scattered evidence suggests widespread resistance to courtly love's constraints. Regional differences shaped women's experiences. In southern France, where courtly love originated, some women gained unprecedented influence as patrons of troubadours. In northern courts, the tradition arrived filtered through more conservative religious attitudes. German mini-singers created even more distant, abstract relationships. Italian courts eventually produced Dante's Beatrice, a woman so idealized she barely seemed human. The further from its origins, the more suffocating courtly love became. The emotional toll shows in what little writing survived. These women describe loneliness within crowds of admirers, the exhaustion of constant performance, the grief of denying their own hearts to maintain others' ideals. They speak of feeling like actresses in someone else's play, valued only for how well they performed roles written by men, for men, about women who existed more in imagination than reality. Not all women accepted the system. Some rejected courtly suitors entirely, choosing genuine partnerships over elaborate games. Others fled to convents rather than participate in what they saw as sophisticated emotional exploitation. A few wrote directly against courtly love's conventions, though most of these works were suppressed or lost. Their rebellion was quiet but persistent, choosing authenticity over performance, substance over symbol. By the 14th century, female writers openly mocked courtly love's pretensions. Christine de Pizan, writing around 1400, created female characters who dismissed suffering knights as self-indulgent and chose partners based on practical compatibility rather than poetic devotion. Her women wanted husbands, not worshippers. Her work signals courtly love's decline, killed partly by the women it claimed to honor. As you drift toward sleep, remember the Countess of Da's quiet rebellion, her refusal to pretend that beautiful suffering was actually beautiful. She wanted love, not worship, partnership, not performance. Her voice, almost lost to time, reminds us that behind every romantic system are real people with genuine feelings that systems rarely accommodate. Sometimes the most radical act is simply admitting what you actually want. Picture this: a medieval husband watching his wife receive poetry from a lovesick knight. He doesn't rage or challenge anyone to a duel. Instead, he nods approvingly. This seems backward to us, but in the world of courtly love, husbands often encouraged these relationships. They understood the game being played, understood that their wives were performers on a stage, not lovers in a bedroom. A prestigious household needed devoted knights writing sonnets about their lady's beauty. The husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine knew dozens of knights competed for her favour at the courts of love. He watched them debate whether marriage could contain true passion, watched his wife judge their poems and award small tokens for cleverness. This wasn't about romance, this was politics dressed as poetry. A woman who inspired devotion brought honour to her family name. The husband became more powerful through his wife's magnetic presence. Think of it like theatre. The knight performs desperate longing, writing verses about sleepless nights and burning hearts. The lady performs gracious distance, accepting his devotion while maintaining proper boundaries. The husband performs sophisticated tolerance, showing the world his confidence and his wife's desirability. Everyone knows their role. Everyone stays in character. The performance elevates them all above the crude realities of arranged marriages and political alliances. But sometimes the line between performance and reality started to blur. Court records from 1180s France reveal the first cracks in this system. A knight named Geoffrey de Montfort claimed his love for Lady Isabel of Brittany was purely courtly, yet witnesses spotted them alone in the castle's herb garden after evening prayers. Her husband began asking uncomfortable questions. The theatrical distance that made courtly love safe was collapsing into something dangerously real. The smart husbands established clear boundaries. They would allow their wives to receive poetry and accept tribute in the great hall, but private meetings were forbidden. A knight could kiss her hand in public ceremony, but never walk with her unescorted. These rules protected everyone. The wife enjoyed the attention without compromising her reputation. The knight got to play his romantic role without crossing into adultery. The husband maintained control while appearing magnanimous. William Marshall, one of England's greatest knights, wrote about serving as a courtly lover to Lady Margaret of Flanders in the 1170s. Her husband not only permitted this devotion but encouraged it. Knowing Marshall's reputation would enhance his household's prestige, Marshall composed songs, wore her colours in tournaments, and suffered beautifully over his unrequited love. Everyone benefited. The lady felt desired. The knight practiced refined behaviour. The husband gained a powerful ally. The system worked best when everyone understood the rules. A husband could display his wife's desirability while trusting the courtly love code to prevent actual infidelity. The knights competed for favour through poetry and brave deeds, not seduction. The wives enjoyed power and attention within safe boundaries. It was a delicate balance, sophisticated enough to seem romantic, structured enough to remain safe. But human nature has a way of complicating even the most carefully designed games. The trouble came when genuine feeling developed beneath the performance. A knight might start his devotion as courtly theatre, but find himself actually falling in love. A wife might enjoy the attention so much she began encouraging more intimate expressions of devotion. Husbands who had been confident in their control suddenly found themselves dealing with real emotional entanglements, disguised as harmless courtly play. The performance was becoming reality, and reality was dangerous. The case of Lancelot and Guinevere in Arthurian legend reflects real courtly love scandals of the 12th century. Arthur initially tolerates Lancelot's devotion to his queen because it follows courtly rules. The knight serves from a respectful distance, channels his passion into heroic deeds, never crosses physical boundaries. But when that devotion becomes actual adultery, it destroys the kingdom. Medieval audiences understood this as a cautionary tale about courtly love gone wrong. Some husbands grew suspicious of the whole system. Henry II of England reportedly became uncomfortable with Eleanor's courts of love at Poitiers, where she and her daughter Marie held elaborate debates about the nature of romantic devotion. Too many knights were writing too much poetry to his wife. The theoretical discussions about whether marriage could contain true love seemed to be encouraging practical experiments in adultery, disguised as courtly sophistication. The scandal of Heloise and Abelard in the 1110s showed what happened when courtly love's boundaries collapsed entirely. Abelard was supposed to be her tutor. She was supposed to be a refined lady accepting intellectual devotion. Instead, they became lovers, had a child, and destroyed both their lives. Medieval writers used their story as a warning. This is what happens when the performance becomes real, when courtly love turns into actual passion. By the 1200s, husbands were developing more sophisticated strategies. They would encourage courtly devotion from specific knights they could trust, older men, deeply religious ones, or knights they held political leverage over. They avoided allowing young, passionate knights to serve as their wives' courtly lovers. The game required careful management. The wrong knight with the wrong temperament could turn harmless theatre into dangerous reality. Smart husbands became casting directors for their wives' romantic performances. The poetry itself reveals how husbands tried to control these relationships. Surviving verses often include lines praising the lady's husband alongside her beauty, acknowledging his wisdom in allowing courtly devotion, thanking him for his trust. The knights were required to honour the husband as part of honouring the wife. This kept everyone's roles clear. The husband wasn't a rival to be defeated, but a noble patron to be respected within the courtly love framework. When courtly love did cross into adultery, the consequences were severe. A husband's reputation depended on his ability to control his household. If he couldn't manage his wife's behaviour, how could he be trusted with lands or armies? Court records show several cases where husbands who had initially encouraged courtly devotion to their wives later accused those same knights of seduction. The line between performance and betrayal was razor thin, and crossing it destroyed lives. The most successful courtly love arrangements lasted for years without crossing into physical reality. The knight maintained his devoted service, the lady accepted his homage graciously, and the husband basked in the prestige of having a wife who inspired such refined devotion. It was a delicate dance that required all three participants to understand their roles perfectly. When it worked, everyone won. When it failed, the medieval equivalent of divorce court awaited, which usually meant exile or death. The husband's role in courtly love reveals something profound about medieval society. These men understood that marriage was political, but human nature craved romance, so they created a system where their wives could experience adoration and their knights could practice refinement, all while keeping actual marriage separate from romantic fantasy. It was sophisticated theatre designed to manage dangerous emotions. Sometimes it worked beautifully, sometimes it destroyed everything it touched. But it was never, ever simple. By 1150, courtly love had outgrown its birthplace in southern France. Like expensive perfume carried by travelling merchants, it drifted north through trade routes and marriage alliances. Eleanor of Aquitaine packed it in her dowry when she married Louis VII of France, then smuggled it to England with Henry II. What started as local entertainment in Provençal courts became Europe's most exclusive game, but only if you could afford the entry fee. Geography mattered, because sophistication required models. A German knight couldn't invent courtly love from scratch in his drafty castle. He needed to see it performed properly, watch how a troubadour approached a countess, observe the delicate dance of public devotion and private restraint. Cultural refinement travelled person to person, court to court, carried by poets and nobles who'd witnessed the original art form. Northern France embraced courtly love differently than the south. Where Provençal troubadours had been playful, almost theatrical, northern courts made it more serious, more ritualized. The trouvères of Champagne and Burgundy wrote longer, more complex poems. They codified rules the southerners had improvised. What had been spontaneous flirtation became ceremonial protocol, complete with judges and formal debates. Eleanor of Aquitaine deserves credit as courtly love's first international export manager. When she established her court at Poitiers around 1170, she created a finishing school for romantic sophistication. Young nobles from across Europe came to learn proper devotion techniques. She literally held courts of love, formal tribunals where knights presented romantic dilemmas and received official judgments on correct courtly behavior. In England, courtly love merged with Celtic storytelling traditions to create something new entirely. The Arthurian romances, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, took French courtly conventions and wrapped them in British mythology. English poets understood that forbidden love needed legendary settings to feel properly tragic. Reality was too small for such enormous suffering. German Minnesang adapted courtly love to their own cultural landscape. Minnesang, literally love song, kept the essential structure but added Germanic intensity. Where French troubadours had been elegant, German poets became almost mystical. They wrote about love as spiritual discipline, drawing connections between romantic longing and religious devotion that would later influence Christian mysticism. Italy transformed courtly love into intellectual philosophy. When Dante wrote about Beatrice, he wasn't just following French fashion, he was theologizing it. Italian poets asked deeper questions. What did unrequited love reveal about the nature of desire itself? How did earthly longing connect to divine love? They turned romantic suffering into a university curriculum. But geography wasn't the only barrier to courtly love participation. Social class created an invisible wall around these romantic games. You needed leisure time to compose poetry, education to understand literary references, wealth to give gifts, and political security to risk public emotional display. Peasants couldn't afford to love hopelessly. They needed love that produced children and shared labor. Time itself was a luxury that separated courtly lovers from everyone else. A blacksmith couldn't spend hours writing verses about his beloved's eyebrows. He had horseshoes to forge. A farmer's wife couldn't receive elaborate courtly devotion. She had crops to tend. Courtly love required the kind of empty calendar that only aristocrats possessed. The clerical class created another boundary. While some educated clergy wrote courtly poetry, official church doctrine condemned it as sinful frivolity. Priests were supposed to love God exclusively. Monks took vows of chastity that made romantic devotion inappropriate. Yet many clergy secretly participated, creating a tension between spiritual and earthly love that enriched medieval literature. Sophistication acted as courtly love's most effective gatekeeper. You couldn't fake the cultural knowledge required to play properly. References to classical mythology, understanding of poetic meters, awareness of current literary trends, these weren't skills you picked up casually. Courtly love demanded what we might now call cultural capital, and that was distributed very unequally across medieval society. Language barriers reinforced social exclusion. Courtly poetry was written in specific dialects, Occasion in the south, Old French in the north, Middle High German across the Rhine. These weren't languages common people spoke. Even if a peasant somehow gained access to courtly gatherings, he wouldn't understand the linguistic nuances that made courtly love sophisticated rather than crude. Material culture mattered too. Courtly love required props, fine clothing to wear at gatherings, musical instruments to accompany poetry, expensive gifts to demonstrate devotion, quality parchment for written verses. A knight's entire appearance communicated his fitness to participate in romantic games. Shabby lovers weren't taken seriously, regardless of their emotional sincerity. Women's participation faced additional restrictions beyond social class. Only certain women could receive courtly devotion, typically married noblewomen with sufficient rank and reputation. Unmarried women were inappropriate targets because courtly love was supposed to be unconsummated. Lower-class women lacked the social protection that made public romantic attention acceptable, rather than scandalous. The geographical spread of courtly love reveals something important about medieval cultural transmission. Ideas didn't spread randomly. They followed power networks, marriage alliances, and trade routes. A romantic convention born in one court could reach another only through personal connections between aristocrats. Cultural influence required political access. By 1200, courtly love had become Europe's most exclusive club, one that required noble birth, extensive education, considerable wealth, and sophisticated cultural knowledge for membership. What started as entertainment in southern French courts had evolved into a complex social system that reinforced aristocratic identity. Love itself had become a marker of class distinction. By 1340, something had shifted in the great halls of Europe. Young knights rolled their eyes when old poets recited verses about suffering for distant ladies. The elaborate rituals of courtly love, the dramatic sighs, the public pining, the careful rules about never touching your beloved, all of it suddenly seemed ridiculous. A new generation had arrived, shaped by plague and war, and they had very different ideas about love, marriage, and what actually mattered in life. The Black Death changed everything, starting in 1347. When a third of Europe died within 5 years, the survivors stopped caring about refined romantic games. Why spend years writing poetry to someone else's wife, when life could end tomorrow? The plague survivors wanted marriages that meant something: partnerships, companionship, shared survival. The idea of loving someone you could never have felt like a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. The 100 Years' War, grinding on from 1337 to 1453, killed the last romantic notions about knightly service. Real battlefields weren't tournaments where you wore a lady's colours and fought for honour. They were muddy, brutal places where men died of dysentery more often than sword wounds. Knights who survived Crécy and Poitiers came home with no patience for pretending that warfare was noble, or that unrequited love built character. The young nobles of 1380 had grown up hearing their grandfathers' stories about courtly love, and they found them embarrassing. All that elaborate suffering over married women who barely acknowledged your existence, all those rules about staying distant and refined. These new generations wanted wives they could actually talk to, partnerships that made sense, love that led somewhere real instead of endless, beautiful frustration. Geoffrey Chaucer understood exactly what was happening. Writing in the 1380s, he crafted stories that gently mocked everything courtly love held sacred. His Canterbury Tales are full of characters who expose the absurdity of the old romantic ideals. Chaucer had lived through the plague, seen the old certainties crumble. He wrote for readers who were ready to laugh at what their ancestors had taken so seriously. In The Knight's Tale, Chaucer presents two knights, Palamon and Arcite, who fall in love with the same woman from their prison window. They've never spoken to her. She doesn't know they exist, yet they're willing to fight to the death over her. Chaucer's audience would have recognized this as perfect courtly love and laughed at how ridiculous it sounds when you describe it plainly. Love at first sight through prison bars. Other writers joined the mockery. The Romance of the Rose, completed around 1275, had been deadly serious about allegorical love. But by 1400, similar works were being written as parodies. French poets created mock courtly poems where knights fell in love with kitchen maids, or where ladies commanded their devoted servants to perform embarrassing, meaningless tasks. The whole system had become a joke that everyone was in on. Social structures were shifting beneath the old romantic ideals. The feudal system that had supported courtly love was breaking down. Knights were becoming obsolete as gunpowder changed warfare. The rigid hierarchies that made loving someone above your station both impossible and therefore poetic were loosening. social mobility was increasing. Why worship someone unattainable when you might actually be able to marry within your new station? A rising merchant class brought practical values to romance. These were people who built their wealth through trade, negotiation, and careful partnerships. Their marriages needed to work as business ventures and emotional connections. They had no time for the aristocratic luxury of loving someone you could never have. They wanted wives who could manage households, husbands who could provide security. Love was wonderful, but it needed to be useful. The Renaissance, beginning in 14th century Italy, brought humanist ideas about love and marriage. Scholars rediscovered classical texts that emphasized companionship between spouses, mutual respect, shared intellectual interests. The idea that suffering made you noble started to seem medieval, literally outdated. Renaissance thinkers believed humans should flourish, not languish in beautiful despair over impossible relationships they'd designed to stay impossible. Protestant reformers of the 16th century actively rejected courtly love as Catholic corruption. They saw the worship of distant ladies as dangerously close to worshipping saints, or worse, the Virgin Mary. Protestant theology emphasized marriage as a holy partnership, not a practical arrangement that left room for elaborate extramarital devotion. Martin Luther himself married a former nun, making a clear statement about the value of companionate marriage over celibate idealization. New marriage ideals were emerging by 1500. Writers began promoting the radical idea that husbands and wives should be friends, not just economic partners or objects of distant worship. Marriage manuals appeared, teaching couples how to build companionship. The concept that spouses should know each other, enjoy each other's company, share interests beyond bloodlines and property. These ideas would have seemed bizarre to the troubadours of 1150. Women's roles were changing too, at least among the educated classes. Renaissance women like Christine de Pizan wrote about love from female perspectives, often critiquing the way courtly love had turned women into distant symbols rather than real people. They wanted to be partners in relationships, not pedestals for male devotion. The idea of being worshipped from afar began to seem less flattering and more lonely. The troubadour courts that had invented courtly love were disappearing. The sophisticated literary culture of medieval Provence had been disrupted by war and plague. The elaborate courts where nobles debated questions of love were being replaced by more practical concerns, governing territories, managing trade, dealing with religious upheaval. There was simply no institutional support left for the old romantic games. What replaced courtly love was something both simpler and more complex, romantic love, that aimed for mutual fulfillment rather than beautiful frustration. Young people began expecting to marry someone they actually liked, not just someone who would advance their family's interests. The idea that love should lead to happiness, not suffering, gained ground. It wasn't less romantic, it was romantic in a completely different way. As you drift towards sleep, picture that moment when an entire culture's romantic ideals shifted. Imagine young lovers in 1400, reading their grandparents' love poetry and thinking, "This sounds exhausting. Why would anyone choose permanent longing over the possibility of genuine partnership?" Perhaps every generation needs to reinvent love for itself, keeping what serves life, and letting the rest become beautiful, outdated museum pieces. Courtly love died out centuries ago, but its ghost still haunts every romance novel, every love song about wanting someone you can't have, every movie where the hero pines dramatically instead of just asking someone out. We think we've moved beyond medieval ideas about love, but scratch the surface of modern romance and you'll find the same strange patterns, the same elevation of suffering, the same belief that obstacles make love more valuable. Tonight, we're tracing these invisible threads. Here's the central paradox of courtly love. Women were simultaneously elevated and erased. Within the system, they held incredible power. Knights knelt before them, wrote poetry to them, declared them the source of all virtue and refinement. A lady could command armies of devoted admirers with a glance. But this power came at a cost. They weren't seen as real people with desires, flaws, and agency. They became living symbols, perfect abstractions, pedestals in human form. Walk through any bookstore's romance section today, and you're seeing courtly love's children, the brooding hero who worships from afar, the unattainable love interest who seems perfect because we never really know them, the idea that true love requires struggle, that easy relationships somehow don't count. We've kept all the drama and longing, but flipped the ending. Now the knight is supposed to get the girl, but the basic template, pure medieval. Unrequited love used to be considered a flaw, a failure to find mutual affection. Courtly love made it a virtue. Suddenly, loving someone who couldn't love you back became noble, even holy. The troubadours sang about it like a spiritual achievement. This idea burrowed so deep into Western culture that we still romanticize one-sided love. Pop songs celebrate it. Movies make it beautiful. We've turned emotional pain into entertainment, and it started in those medieval courts. The friend zone, that modern source of dating frustration, has medieval roots. Courtly love literally institutionalized the idea that a woman should receive male devotion while offering nothing physical in return. Knights were expected to serve faithfully without reward, to find meaning in the service itself. Sound familiar? The terminology changed, but the dynamic didn't. We just stopped calling it noble and started calling it cruel. Same game, different century. Courtly love taught us that suffering proves authenticity. If you're not in emotional agony, you must not really be in love. The troubadours wrote about sleepless nights, loss of appetite, physical weakness from lovesickness, and called it beautiful. This idea stuck. Modern love songs are full of pain, heartbreak, and longing. We're suspicious of relationships that look too easy, too happy. Suffering became our romantic credential, and we're still showing it off. Medieval knights turned love into a quest with obstacles, trials, and distant goals. Modern dating apps do the same thing. Swiping, matching, waiting for responses, playing hard to get. We've gamified romance because courtly love taught us that difficulty creates value. Easy love feels cheap. We want to earn it, fight for it, prove ourselves worthy. The battlefield changed from tournament grounds to Instagram DMs, but we're still jousting for attention. The less available someone is, the more we want them. Courtly love codified this psychological quirk into a romantic system. Knights were supposed to love married women, unavailable women, distant women they'd never met. The impossibility was the point. Dating advice still reflects this. Play hard to get. Don't seem too eager. Maintain mystery. We learned to mistake scarcity for value, and we've been confusing ourselves ever since. Courtly love invented the idea that profound emotion requires artistic expression. Knights wrote poetry, composed songs, commissioned artwork, all to capture their feelings for someone they'd barely spoken to. This romantic creativity became our template for authentic love. Now we expect love letters, playlists, thoughtful gifts. We measure devotion by artistic effort. Someone who loves you should write you songs, take beautiful photos, express their feelings in creative ways. Art became love's proof. Courtly love created a split between marriage and passion that we're still trying to reconcile. Marriage was practical, for property, politics, and children. Real love was something else entirely, something that couldn't coexist with mundane partnership. This left us with competing ideals, the reliable spouse versus the exciting lover. We want both in the same person, but courtly love taught us they were different things. Some people still believe great love and stable marriage are mutually exclusive. The romantic hero archetype, brooding, devoted, willing to suffer for love, that's pure courtly love DNA. From Heathcliff to Mr. Darcy to Edward Cullen, our most enduring romantic figures are knights in modern clothing. They worship from afar. They're tormented by their feelings. They prove their worth through sacrifice and dedication. We keep retelling the same story because courtly love convinced us that this is what deep love looks like. Intense, painful, all-consuming. Renaissance literature tried to move past courtly love, but couldn't quite escape it. Shakespeare both mocked it and used it. Romeo and Juliet are classic courtly lovers, obsessed with someone they barely know, finding meaning in obstacles. Even when writers criticized the tradition, they borrowed its emotional intensity. Romantic literature has been in conversation with courtly love for 800 years. We keep trying to evolve past it, but its patterns are too deeply embedded. Turn on the radio and you'll hear courtly love's greatest hits. Songs about wanting someone you can't have, lyrics about suffering for love, ballads that celebrate longing over fulfillment. The troubadours would recognize these themes immediately. We've electrified their lutes and added drum beats, but the emotional content hasn't changed. Popular music is still selling the idea that the best love is impossible love, that heartbreak is more interesting than happiness. Even our wedding traditions echo courtly love. The bride as prize to be won, the groom proving his devotion through expensive gestures. The idea that marriage represents conquest after a period of pursuit. Wedding photos often recreate medieval imagery, flowing dresses, dramatic poses, the sense of fairy tale romance. We're still acting out courtly love's script, just with better catering and professional photographers. The ceremony celebrates winning the quest. Why do these patterns persist? Because courtly love tapped into something real about human psychology, the power of anticipation, the intensity of desire, the meaning we find in overcoming obstacles. It just packaged these natural tendencies into an elaborate social system. Modern life removed the system but kept the psychology. We still crave drama, still find easy love slightly boring, still believe that suffering somehow validates our feelings. Some medieval insights were surprisingly durable. As you drift towards sleep, consider courtly love's strangest legacy. It convinced us that the most profound emotions come from what we can't have rather than what we do have. Maybe that's why contentment feels less romantic than yearning, why satisfied couples seem less interesting than star-crossed lovers. Medieval courts invented a love system based on permanent dissatisfaction, and somehow we made it the foundation of Western romance. Sweet dreams, modern knights and ladies. Walk into any modern wedding and you're watching medieval courtly love performed with white dresses and wedding cake. The groom approaches like a knight on a quest, nervous and formal, proving his worthiness through expensive rings and elaborate proposals. The bride enters as the prize, veiled and escorted by her father, who literally gives her away. Every tradition echoes those strange courtly rules, the public display of devotion, the ritualized waiting, the moment when longing finally becomes possession. We've kept the theatre, we just changed the ending. Think about how a modern engagement unfolds. The man plans secretly, chooses the perfect moment, goes down on one knee, exactly like a knight declaring his service to a lady. He presents a ring, she considers his worthiness, the audience of family and friends witnesses the ritual. The months of wedding planning that follow mirror courtly love's extended courtship, public displays, elaborate preparations, everyone watching to see if they'll perform their roles correctly. The waiting, the anticipation, the obstacles, it's all still there in designer packaging. The white wedding dress carries courtly love's strangest contradiction. Medieval ladies wore their finest clothes in any colour, but Victorian England transformed the bride into something ethereal, untouchable, set apart from ordinary life. Like a courtly lady on her pedestal, she becomes a symbol rather than a person for one day. Everyone stares but no one touches. She's beautiful, distant, the prize at the end of the quest. The groom waits at the altar like a knight, awaiting his reward. Patient, formal, performing worthiness. Father of the bride, may I have your daughter's hand? This phrase preserves medieval property law wrapped in romantic language. In courtly love, the lady was always someone else's, married to a lord, protected by a father, forever out of reach. The marriage ceremony still reenacts this transfer of ownership, just softened with sentiment. Dad walks her down the aisle, hands her to the groom, sits down. The symbolism is ancient. The knight has completed his quest, proven his worth, earned his prize through patience and public devotion. Medieval knights wore their ladies' colours in tournaments, carried her ribbon into battle, displayed their devotion publicly. Modern grooms propose with diamond rings worth months of salary, post engagement photos on social media, throw bachelor parties announcing their upcoming capture of the prize. The economics are different, but the psychology is identical. Public proof of worthiness, expensive tokens of devotion, rituals that demonstrate he's earned what he cannot simply take. The courtly performance continues, just with different props and audiences. Wedding vows preserve courtly love's language of service and devotion. I promise to love, honor, cherish, protect. These are knightly oaths adapted for marriage. The groom pledges eternal service, just like a medieval knight swearing allegiance to his lady. The bride graciously accepts his devotion, grants him her favor. Both perform before witnesses who judge whether they're doing it correctly. The ceremony transforms courtly love's permanent longing into sanctified possession, but keeps all the ritual language of quest, service and reward. Bridesmaids and groomsmen echo medieval court attendants, who supervised courtly love affairs. They ensure proper behavior, witness the ritual, make sure both parties follow the script. The best man historically protected the groom during bride capture. Literally, bridesmaids traditionally protected the bride's virtue and helped her prepare for the ceremony. Modern wedding parties maintain this structure of supervised courtship, just transformed into party planning and emotional support. Everyone still has a role in the performance. Everyone watches everyone else. The wedding reception celebrates the end of the quest, the moment courtly love's impossible dream becomes reality. Medieval feasts honored knights returning from successful missions. Now we honor grooms who've successfully won their brides. The couple sits at the head table, like lord and lady of the manor. Guests toast their achievement, tell stories of the courtship, celebrate the completion of the ritual. The cake cutting becomes the first joint act of their new partnership, but everyone remembers she was the prize he worked to win. Watch couples dating today, and you'll see courtly love everywhere. He pays for dinner, she graciously accepts. He pursues, she considers his worthiness. He brings flowers, she grants him time and attention. The man proves devotion through gestures. The woman maintains some distance while evaluating his suitability. Dating apps just systematize the process. Tinder is a digital court where knights display their credentials and ladies decide who merits their attention. Same game, new platform. The honeymoon represents courtly love's final transformation, the forbidden consummation finally achieved. Medieval knights could never possess their ladies. Modern grooms get a tropical vacation to celebrate successful possession. The couple disappears from public view. Finally alone after months of witnessed courtship, they return as husband and wife instead of pursuer and pursued. The honeymoon marks the end of the quest narrative and the beginning of partnership, though the wedding photos preserve the courtly romance version forever. Wedding photography captures the courtly performance at its peak. The bride ethereal and untouchable, the groom devoted and worthy, the ceremony formal and ritualized. These images preserve the quest narrative, even as the reality becomes daily partnership, doing laundry, splitting bills, negotiating whose turn it is to take out trash. The photos maintain the fiction that marriage is about knights and ladies rather than two people choosing to build a life together. We display the courtly theatre, live the practical partnership. Valentine's Day weaponizes courtly love for profit. Medieval knights wrote poetry and suffered dramatically. Modern men buy chocolates and jewelry or face relationship disaster. The holiday preserves courtly love's emphasis on male pursuit and female evaluation, but commercializes the gestures. He proves devotion through expensive gifts. She judges his effort. The roses, the romantic dinners, the jewelry advertisements, all echo knights demonstrating worthiness to distant ladies. Same psychological structure, different economic incentives. The wedding industry profits from courtly love's elevation of the bride. Like a medieval lady on her pedestal, she deserves the perfect dress, perfect venue, perfect day. Everyone serves her vision. Photographers, florists, caterers, wedding planners. The groom pays the bills, but she makes the choices, just like courtly love's power dynamic. Wedding shows, bridal magazines, Pinterest boards, they all reinforce the idea that the bride is the star, the prize, the reason for the entire expensive performance. Medieval respect for noble ladies becomes modern bridal consumerism. Romantic comedies preserve courtly love's narrative structure perfectly. Hero pursues heroine through obstacles, proves his worthiness, wins her love through persistence and grand gestures. She remains slightly distant, evaluating his efforts, finally granting him her heart. The movies end at the wedding because that's where courtly love always ended, at the moment of reward. Real partnership, daily compromise, shared responsibilities, those aren't part of the quest narrative. The films preserve the courtly fantasy, ignore the marriage reality. Modern relationship advice still echoes courtly love rules. Play hard to get. Make him work for it. Don't be too available. Be mysterious. These strategies treat dating like a medieval court, where ladies maintained power through distance, and men proved devotion through persistence. The advice assumes he should pursue while she evaluates. He should demonstrate worthiness while she grants favor gradually. Even in an era of supposed equality, we default to courtly love's gendered roles, pursuer and pursued, knight and prize. As you drift towards sleep, consider what we've inherited from those medieval courts. The white dress, the expensive ring, the father giving away his daughter, the groom's patient waiting, the bride's elevated status, all echoes of a love system that worshipped from afar. We kept the theatre, but changed the ending, preserved the quest but allowed the prize. Perhaps that's why weddings feel both magical and slightly artificial. We're performing an ancient ritual designed for a world where love wasn't meant to succeed. Tonight, we're stepping back from the medieval courts to ask a question that might sound strange. Was courtly love actually torture? Those knights writing poetry to women they'd never touch, those ladies granting ribbons instead of kisses, they created a system that glorified suffering. Yet here we are, centuries later, still telling stories about love that hurts, still writing songs about wanting what we can't have. Maybe there's something in that ancient longing we haven't quite understood yet. Think about the last time you really wanted something before you got it. That electric anticipation, the way possibilities shimmer when they're just out of reach. Courtly love understood this feeling and built an entire romantic philosophy around it, never fulfilling the desire, never crossing that final line. The troubadours called it refined love, but from here it looks suspiciously like sophisticated emotional self-harm, beautiful, elaborate, completely unsustainable self-harm. Andreas Capellanus wrote the rules around 1185, 31 commandments for proper courtly love. Rule number 12 still makes me wince. A true lover is constantly obsessed by the image of his beloved. Constantly obsessed. He wasn't describing romance, he was describing what we'd now recognize as an unhealthy fixation. Yet for 3 centuries, European nobles treated this obsession as the highest form of love, as spiritual refinement through romantic suffering. But let's be fair to the past. Courtly love did something revolutionary for its time. It gave women power in romantic relationships. The lady was the judge, the goal, the source of moral improvement. Her knight served her wishes, not the other way round. In a world where most noble women were married off like political chess pieces, courtly love created spaces where they held all the cards, where men competed for their attention, their approval, their smallest gestures of favour. The Countess of Dia understood the game's contradictions better than most. One of the few female troubadours whose words survive, she wrote about loving a knight too much, then pulling back to maintain the proper distance. The result? Genuine suffering without the promised spiritual rewards. She saw through the pretty poetry to the emotional manipulation underneath. Love yourself into knots for my entertainment. Call it refinement. Call it anything but what it really was. Here's what courtly love got right, though. It recognized that anticipation can be its own pleasure. That longing, properly channeled, creates art. Some of the most beautiful poetry in Western literature came from troubadours who never touched their beloved's hand. They transformed sexual frustration into something transcendent, created beauty from the space between desire and fulfillment, made an aesthetic out of never quite getting what you wanted. But the psychological cost was enormous. Knights who played this game correctly were expected to lose sleep, lose appetite, lose interest in everything except their impossible love. Bernard de Ventadorn compared himself to Narcissus, wasting away from unrequited desire, and called it wisdom. The system literally encouraged what we'd now recognize as depression and anxiety. It valorized the symptoms of lovesickness as signs of moral superiority. Modern love looks messy by comparison. We fight over whose turn it is to do dishes. We see each other sick, tired, grumpy before coffee. We know too much about each other's bathroom habits. There's nothing elevated about arguing over mortgage payments or whose mother gets Christmas this year. Courtly love never had to navigate shared bank accounts or disagreements about whether to have children. It existed in a realm of pure, impossible romance. Yet that messiness is also modern love's greatest strength. We get to actually know the person we're with. Not the idealized version, not the fantasy we've constructed, but the real human being who laughs at stupid jokes and knows how you take your coffee. Courtly lovers worshipped strangers, projected perfection onto people they barely knew. Modern lovers have the opportunity for genuine intimacy, for being known and loved anyway. The courtly tradition did leave us some valuable insights about the importance of effort in romance. Those knights worked for their lady's attention. They wrote poetry, performed brave deeds, thought carefully about how to please her. Modern relationships suffer when we stop trying to impress each other, when we take the other person's love for granted. Maybe we need some of that medieval intention without the medieval impossibility. Courtly love also understood something about mystery, about leaving room for imagination. When everything is known, catalogued, posted on social media, something gets lost. The medieval lovers preserved spaces of uncertainty, of possibility. They understood that revealing everything immediately might diminish rather than deepen connection. Though they took this principle to such an extreme, it became parody. But here's the trap. Courtly love set for itself. It confused longing with loving, wanting with caring. The knight's devotion was ultimately self-focused. His suffering, his poetry, his grand gestures, they were about his own emotional experience, not about actually serving the lady's needs or happiness. Real love sometimes means accepting that your beloved might be happier with someone else. Courtly love could never make that sacrifice. By the 14th century, writers like Chaucer were already mocking courtly love's conventions. The Knight's Tale features 2 men fighting over a woman who doesn't want either of them. The joke was becoming obvious. How can you truly love someone whose actual feelings don't matter to your devotion? How can you serve someone you're not allowed to really know? The The system was beautiful in theory, impossible in practice. Modern love inherited both the best and worst of courtly traditions. We still tell stories about love that hurts, still romanticize rejection and pursuit. The friend zone is just courtly love without the poetry. But we also inherited something more valuable, the idea that love should elevate both people involved, that romance can inspire us to become better versions of ourselves. We just learned to do it together instead of apart. Perhaps the real tragedy of courtly love wasn't the suffering, it was the waste. All that devotion, all that creative energy, all that genuine human feeling channeled into relationships designed never to flourish. Think of the actual partnerships that might have grown from that foundation, if the lovers had been allowed to move closer instead of maintaining eternal distance. Think of the real intimacy sacrificed for the performance of impossible romance. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this strange inheritance from the medieval world. The tension between wanting and having, between mystery and intimacy, between romance as performance and love as partnership. Maybe the troubadours were right, that anticipation sweetens everything, but maybe they were wrong, that fulfillment ruins it. Maybe the real art is learning to keep some of that medieval wonder alive, while still allowing ourselves to come close. So here we are, at the end of this strange medieval love story. After exploring knights who never kissed their beloveds, troubadours who sang to married women, and courts that turned longing into high art, what remains? What did they actually discover in all that elaborate suffering? The answer might surprise you. Courtly love wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was an experiment in making desire itself beautiful. They found something we've mostly forgotten. Think about it this way. In our world, love stories end when the couple gets together. Roll credits, happily ever after. But medieval courtly love said the opposite, that getting together would actually end the story. The magic lived in the space between wanting and having, in that electric moment before a kiss, stretched out for years. They discovered that anticipation has its own special intensity. This wasn't just medieval weirdness. They stumbled onto something psychologically real. Modern research confirms what those troubadours knew. The dopamine rush of anticipation often exceeds the satisfaction of achievement. Christmas morning is rarely as magical as Christmas Eve. The restaurant you're dying to try sometimes disappoints once you finally go. They built an entire romantic system around preserving that delicious almost moment. Of course, there was a dark side to all this beautiful longing. Real women got trapped in impossible positions, expected to inspire knights while remaining untouchable, to be simultaneously powerful and passive. Their actual desires, their real personalities, often disappeared behind the fantasy versions men created. The system elevated women to goddess status while denying their basic humanity. That contradiction haunts romantic ideals even today. But here's what's fascinating about courtly love's legacy. It invented the template for romantic intensity that we still recognize. The idea that love should involve suffering, that obstacles make feelings stronger, that devotion means putting someone on a pedestal. All of this comes from those medieval courts. Even our language reflects it. We still talk about being struck by love like it's a wound. Look at our love songs. How many celebrate being happily married for 20 years? Almost none. They're about wanting someone you can't have, missing someone who left, yearning across distance. The biggest hits are about longing, not satisfaction. Ed Sheeran doesn't write chart toppers about doing laundry together. We inherited the troubadour's belief that desire is more compelling than fulfillment. Even our dating culture shows courtly love's influence. The friend zone, that's just medieval, unrequited devotion with a modern name. The romantic comedy where the protagonist pines for someone obviously wrong for them, pure courtly love structure. We've kept the suffering, the obstacles, the idealization. We just changed the ending to allow actually getting together. What they understood, though, was how to make an art form from yearning itself. Those troubadour poems weren't just complaining, they were transforming desire into something beautiful, taking the raw ache of wanting and crafting it into music, poetry, elaborate rituals. They proved that unfulfilled longing could be as creative and meaningful as satisfied love. This might be their most radical insight, that not every desire needs to be fulfilled to have value. In our instant gratification world, that sounds almost heretical. We're taught that wanting something means you should pursue it, get it, consume it, but courtly love suggested that sometimes the wanting itself is enough. Sometimes it's even better. Think about the knight riding through dark forests, carrying his lady's ribbon into battle, composing verses by candlelight. He's heartbroken, yes, but also fully alive. His unfulfilled love gives him purpose, inspires his best self, connects him to something larger than his own needs. The pain has meaning because it's been transformed into something beautiful. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize their limitations. Medieval women deserved better than being turned into symbols. Knights deserved relationships based on mutual affection rather than elaborate games. The social structures that made courtly love necessary were deeply flawed, but within those constraints they discovered something profound about how humans can create meaning from longing. Maybe that's why their poetry still moves us centuries later. Bernard de Ventadorn, writing "I die of desire, and my heart melts away," he's capturing something universal about human experience, not just medieval experience. The intensity of wanting, the bittersweet beauty of unfulfilled dreams, the way desire can simultaneously torment and elevate us. Their legacy lives on in unexpected places. Every time someone savors the anticipation of seeing someone they love, choosing to extend the delicious uncertainty rather than rushing to resolution, that's courtly love. Every time an artist channels heartbreak into something beautiful, that's their influence. They taught us that longing itself could be a destination. In the end, courtly love was an attempt to solve an impossible problem: how to find transcendence within human limitations, how to create something eternal from temporary feelings, how to make beauty from frustration. They didn't solve it, obviously, but they showed us that the attempt itself has value, that reaching for the impossible can ennoble even failure. So what can we learn from these medieval lovers who never touched? Maybe that not every story needs a happy ending to be meaningful. Maybe that some forms of beauty exist only in the space between wanting and having. Maybe that anticipation, handled with skill and intention, can become its own form of fulfillment. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this gift from the medieval world: the radical idea that desire itself can be sacred, that longing, properly cultivated, becomes a form of devotion, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that never quite resolve. Sweet dreams, and may your own longings, fulfilled or not, bring their own strange beauty.